Today's true crime case is a rough one. It was May 26, 2020, and there was a lot going on in the U.S., including protests over COVID and police violence, a lot of division, anger, and taking of sides, and folks were gearing up for an election as well. People in Minneapolis and the rest of the world, frankly, were waking up to what they thought would be just another day. That is, until the Minneapolis Police Department released a statement talking about a man who died in police custody. They failed to mention that this man and 3 other officers were responsible. They failed to mention what most of us saw in about 9.5 minutes of video. That despite pleas from onlookers, despite George Floyd begging, despite him going flat out unconscious, one officer continued to kneel on his neck, and another, this man, kept everyone, even emergency responders, away. They failed to mention that the officers were so unhelpful that when an ambulance needed help from the fire department was unable to initially locate the ambulance. But it was a, quote, not today, end quote, moment for the Minneapolis PD. As in, you are not covering up a murder today. As in, you are not protecting bad cops today. Soon the internet was awash with video of what really happened. The police department had little choice then but to, quote, update, end quote, their statement with new information. The FBI joined in the investigation, and the 4 officers were put on paid administrative leave. Until just a little later in the day, that is, when they were all fired. Both autopsies and a forensic review of the autopsies determined that Floyd had been murdered. We'll get back to that, as to what happened to the men responsible in a minute. But first, let's examine what happened from the perspective of those who were there. Just what is it that George Floyd could have done to deserve what Derek Chauvin and Tou Thao and the other 2 men did to him? What went so wrong that 3 men, sworn to serve and protect the public, instead stood by and allowed a man to be murdered? Well, George, who was 46 at the time, walked into a store on the evening of May the 25th, 2020. He had a $20 bill and wanted some cigarettes. Counterfeit 20s are so common in America that store owners, like the one that owned the store George went into, that he was a regular at, recognize that most people don't even realize they're passing counterfeit money. Anyhow, George got his cigarettes and left the store to get into his car. He was, again, a regular at the little shop, and there is no indication, no evidence that he was in the habit of passing bad bills there. But the employee realized the bill was no good. They went outside and demanded that George return the cigarettes. George didn't want to. Police were called because the owner had a policy at the time that if a bad bill was passed, even though many bills are passed unknowingly, they called police to determine whether or not there was a crime and whether or not there should be an arrest. That's it. That is what led to the encounter between George Floyd and the 4 men responsible for his death, bad 20, of which there's no evidence Floyd even knew it was bad before buying his cigarettes, and a seemingly reasonable, on the face of it anyway, policy which, unknown to the employee, would end in tragedy. And by the way, that employee would later try to intervene in what happened and was pushed back by one of the officers. What led to George's actual death is more complicated. It involves overly aggressive and negligent officers, a history of covering up for officers like them, the racism that lies deep in and mars the institution, and pure ignorance. Though it doesn't take a doctor to understand that a person can easily die after having their neck restricted for 9.5 minutes, Howe sarcastically deflected on lookers who were begging the men to help Floyd with, quote, "He's talking, he's fine," end quote. For 9.5 minutes, George was not fine, and he would not be fine again. He would not go home to his life, his daughter, his family. Nothing about what happened was fine. When police arrived on scene, Floyd did not immediately respond to their demands, but did open his car door and apologize. The initial responding officer, Lane, had his gun out briefly, ordering Floyd to show his hands. Floyd was removed from his SUV, handcuffed, and sat down on the sidewalk against a wall. He explained that he was recovering from COVID, which is something that has been confirmed at autopsy, that he had anxiety and was claustrophobic. He asked not to sit in the police car, pleaded in fact, and offered to lie on the ground instead. It was shortly after that Derek Chauvin would arrive on scene with Thao, and things turned very bad. If you've not seen the various videos, I don't recommend going to look for them. I won't show them here, and neither will I describe any further what those officers did in detail. It is sufficient to say that they ignored his medical needs. Chauvin compressed George Floyd's neck with his knee for nearly 10 minutes, and the other officers supported Chauvin in the murder, in either restraining George Floyd and continuing to ignore his medical distress, or preventing or delaying potentially life-saving assistance from getting to their suspect. All over a $20 bill passed by a man who was ill and had anxiety, who may not even have known about the bill being bad. In the end, the city of Minneapolis agreed to pay $27 million US after George Floyd's family brought a wrongful death lawsuit. There would be both state and federal charges against the 4 men who were responsible for his murder. Derek Chauvin would get 22.5 years on the state charges of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter after a trial. He entered a guilty plea to the federal charges of violating George Floyd's civil rights by both an unreasonable use of force and disregard for his medical distress. He was later found guilty also of tax evasion charges, demonstrating his very weak commitment to being a law-abiding citizen, even though he was sworn to enforce the law. He received 13 months for that charge, concurrent to everything else. And if you need further evidence, like this isn't more than enough, he also admitted to violating a 14-year-old boy's rights by grabbing him by the throat, hitting him in the head with a flashlight, and kneeling on the handcuffed, non-resisting boy's back. His sentence for this was 21 years to be served concurrently with the murder sentence and the civil rights violations. Lane would enter a guilty plea to aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter and get 36 months in jail. He was also sentenced to 2.5 years concurrent on the federal charges, the civil rights violations. Lane was appointed police officer quite newly, despite having a criminal history that included obstruction of legal processes and property damage. He and Kung would help Chauvin restrain George Floyd on the ground. That was their role in all of this. Kung entered a guilty plea to state charges of aiding and abetting manslaughter and got 40 months in jail, with another 36 months on the federal charges, which is to be served concurrently. Kung was relatively new to policing as well, and Chauvin was responsible for the bulk of Kung's field training, including another incident where Chauvin and Kung, laying in another officer, were excessive with the man they arrested. Luckily for that man, he survived the encounter, though he also experienced restricted breathing and had been wrongfully detained. Thou chose to have the evidence against him reviewed by a judge, and in a 144-page decision, and despite Thou's arguments that he was no more than a, quote, human traffic cone, end quote, he received 56 months in prison. Thou had a previous settled complaint for handcuffing a man without cause, throwing him to the ground, punching, kicking, and kneeing the man, which resulted in hospitalization and broken teeth. His claims that he did nothing wrong in the George Floyd case just kept back traffic. Even to this day, smack a little of the long-debunked Nuremberg argument. Oh, I can't be guilty of doing what I'm told to do, just doing my job. Right. He clearly doesn't get it, and in fact, he says he won't dishonor God by lying and saying, acknowledging his responsibility. And so he has no business ever having any physical authority over another person again, with a police badge or frankly, even as a security guard or, loss prevention officer. Speaking of which, George worked security at a Minneapolis nightclub at one point. He worked overlapping shifts with other guards, which often included police officers. One of those officers that he worked those shifts with, Derek Chauvin, the man who would steal his life. Along with the investigation finding that systemic racism led to George Floyd's unwarranted murder, protests arose all over the world. Protests called for an end to police brutality, an end to the racism that the investigation also agreed exists within police authorities, and holding police officers to account. So chokeholds and neck restraints are now banned in Minneapolis after the State Department of Human Rights opened an investigation into the murder in June of 2020. Officers must now intervene when another officer uses excessive force, and the chief or his delegate, someone he appoints, has to approve the use of crowd control weapons. A judge would also order the police department to cooperate with investigations into civil rights abuses by the police department. That judge also required the chief to make discipline decisions quickly and in a transparent way, no more hiding it from the public. He required that civilian analysts and investigators also be given authority to audit body cams and to file and amend complaints against officers. They had little teeth before that to force any change or deal with bad behavior. The paramilitary and racial discriminatory pattern of behavior within that particular police department was outlined by the state in their April 2022 findings. Chauvin has appealed his conviction. The State Court of Appeals affirmed his conviction, so then he applied to the state Supreme Court, who declined to hear him. He and his lawyers are now planning to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Frankly, it's a long shot in his case. It's a long shot that his case will even be heard at SCOTUS, or that if it is heard there, that anything would change for him. It's not impossible, but it is a long shot, and that's good. Chauvin, Thao, Lane, and Kung are where they belong. The only man who should have walked away cannot, and he cannot as a direct result of what these four men did, and also as an indirect result of the culture of non-accountability, racism, and militarization that they worked in and carried with them into the streets. Our hope here is that real change can take hold in Minneapolis and elsewhere, and that all eyes remain steadily, critically, without fear, but with transparency on those who purport to serve and protect the citizens. If you're enjoying these videos and want more, don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any videos. Thank you for watching. We really appreciate it.